Welcome everyone. As it said, I'm Jen. I work as head of production at the Unicorn Theatre. And just to give you a little bit of context what we're going to do today, so we've got two panels today. We're starting off with our first panel is sort of experts and suppliers and people who aren't necessarily production managers to kind of context it and look at the stakeholders and the people that we deal with and work with. And then we'll have a little break. We'll come back and we'll do a second panel that is either production managers, technical directors, people working front of house, people who are in the theatres on that sort of basis. The reason we're kind of here, so when I spent some time in the last year doing a bit of a baseline for the Unicorn, we were quite good at front of house reductions and energy usage, but we weren't looking at the stage, and I wanted to bring that into the conversation there. And I sort of felt a little bit like I was working a bit in isolation. Like I knew everyone was thinking about this and I knew everyone was doing something about it, but it was just hard to kind of get that information and find out what was going on. So at the PMF AGM kind of raised the idea, could we all get together and discuss this and look at we all have these goals that we're trying to meet, and we know that we've got an issue, but what are we doing? What's everybody doing? How can we pool our resources? How can we bring our knowledge together? So that's sort of how today was, the kernel of today came about. So we're going to start the first panel with a short presentation. I'll just introduce the panelists on the first panel, and then we'll have a short presentation from Julie's Bicycle just to sort of set the context of what we're talking about today. And it would be great if it'll be quite fluid. We'll hear from our panelists, but we'll also take some questions from the live stream and also some comments and thoughts and questions from the audience. So on our first panel, we have Sarah Sherley, who is the head of sales and account management for First Mile. We also have Paul Burgess, who is a practicing designer, but also here representing SBTD. And then we also have Graciela Militsko-Thornton. Did I say that right? Lovely. The Creative Green Program Lead from Julie's Bicycle. And Graciela is going to do the initial opening presentation. I wonder if we could bring, because we're talking about this circular economy and you're talking about linear and then reusing materials, and we actually have sort of kind of both ends of that, working with designers and I wonder if you mind if we bring their voice in now while we're talking about materials and reuse. And I know, Paul, you've done a lot of work and you've had a working group with SBTD talking about designing with different materials or a different aesthetic. Do you want to talk a little bit about what came up in that group?
Yeah, I mean, various different things come up in that group to do with ways of some of which aren't quite around that to do with how we sort of organise our work and work with colleagues and things like that. And there's a lot of interesting stuff which probably can come back to. But in terms of materials, I think the main thing most people felt was there was only a limited amount of available knowledge that was sort of immediate and quick and handy and sort of scaled down to I mean, is it University of Bath that's producing this massive database of
life cycle analysis. Yeah.
But, you know, when you're on the sort of time limits that we're on, we need something much more kind of scaled down than that. But, I mean, there is a lot of enthusiasm amongst designers to get these things right. But I think people are quite intimidated by the scale of all this.
You also mentioned about mirroring that idea of a circular economy with being more circular in our process, so rather than kind of going designer to production manager to workshop, actually that conversation could be tied in between the different parties a little more closely, which I was interested in.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, as you said, starting these conversations as early as possible is really important, and including everyone, and making it a choice, a very deliberate choice to right from the beginning that this is going to be part of the production, this is going to be central to the production. So it's not designing the show and then second to that deciding how to you know, how green can we now make this? But we've got this design, so it's got to look like this at the end, so we can go a bit green on it, but if we go completely green, it's going to compromise the design. Maybe that's the wrong way to look at it. And I think not all designers would buy this argument, but a few of us are moving towards, you know, this, what you might call eco-scenography. And my colleague who's here, Andrea, has got an example, and she's been working this way for a while, so she can talk, if you want to hear more about that, she can say more about the sort of practice of that. But the idea that you start off your design process with an understanding of the limits of what can be done without harming the environment, and you work within that right from the very beginning. And it's a bit like a lot of green approaches, really, like green economics and so on. Is this idea that you acknowledge that you're living in a world with finite resources, and you work within that. And that might mean a very different approach. It might mean a very different aesthetic. And of course, some designers are going to say, no, you know, I shouldn't be limited by that. I've got a right to design what I want, and then we can work out how to build it. But there also seems a lot of enthusiasm for not taking that approach and thinking, you know, sorry, that was a bit of a ramble, but I think it's a really interesting point that we're at, or that some designers are at.
Yeah. And then I think it's interesting too to bring in then what happens at the end, because I think there's this impetus to create this beautiful thing, and then we sort of worry about what's going to happen to it later. And just, I know so many of us are trying to bring that conversation in much earlier in the process.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because at the moment you think about theatres, and where you go into will report on the recycling rate of a theatre and how green it is, all based on that front of house bit, or maybe the back of house offices included as well. But kind of the set part of it becomes this uncontrolled part that doesn't really get reported on. And I think that now people are starting to think more about that, but for a long time that was just kind of kept separate. You know, if we provide environmental reporting for a theatre, that side of it doesn't come into. You think about, you know, an office that's being rebuilt, for example, it's going through a construction process, how much does the construction waste get reported on and where that goes? And this is going to become more and more prevalent in terms of the fact that people are going to have to start adding that into, this is still what's coming out of your theatre or of your workplace, you know, so you're going to have to start being more responsible for it. So I think what we try and do, whether it be with theatres or anybody that we work with, is to say, right, from the beginning, can we be involved and help you with, actually, if you change this material for this material, that would have a better end of life. If you've got a touring show, when it ends, and that set is able to be taken apart, are you building another set that you would then be able to use some of that material for? Would it link up? And sometimes the complexities of what you put into sets, as you were saying, can make it more difficult to then recycle. So is there a way of simplifying the layers of materials or how we put them together so that they're easier to take apart and then recycle? You can look online and there's websites that will help in terms of, you know, they take away sets for you, they take them apart, they'll hold on to, you know, lamps or whatever it may be that you can go and then look to see if they have any of the items that you may need that you could then buy instead of going and getting something from scratch, or materials that are already available. So it is kind of that planning side of it, and it takes more time at the beginning and you are then involving more people from the start. But what then happens is you're able to have a better end of life for your set. And actually, wouldn't it be good to report, because you want to be a zero waste to landfill company, but then a lot of people don't know where their sets are going. So how can you say that if you don't genuinely know what's happening at the end? Because when someone comes and takes it away, have you got anyone who's giving you any reporting, any weight data, understand what it's being used for? Something like the Tottenham Stadium, for example, they use the rubble from their old stadium to help build the ground and area for their new stadium. And we should be doing more things like that. And we absolutely can with theatre sets. When you think about the materials that are used, a lot of the time, they're the same kind of things over and over again. It's probably a bit of a timing issue with some of it, but we could be sharing and using some of that to reduce our footprint. So I think it's really important, and I do think that, you know, in terms of First Mile or recycling companies that you work with, they will be able to help and come in on those initial meetings that would be able to advise on some of these things, and even down to some of the sort of flame retardant coatings and various things you put on that can have an effect. You can start to then help to investigate some of these. So there's lots of things that can be done from the beginning that then make the process better for the end, and a bit of planning.
And because we layer materials so much, so we have something that seems good, and then we have to put a flame retardant in it, or we have to put a texturing on it, or
Yeah, exactly.
and just understanding what all the
And there is, and there's so many complexities, and things change all the time because of the way the recycling industry is. You know, one day you might be able to do something that the next day things have changed.
Yeah.
But I think the simpler we can make it, and to get advice on some of these things means, you know, we've got to do the things of health and safety first of all. Primarily, you've got to make sure that it's safe. But can we make better decisions, or can we change something slightly that would mean that we didn't have to use that then it would have a better end of life? There's so many different options out there, and it is another layer that you've got to add into that beginning. But it does mean that you've got a better feeling at the end of it of what you're going to do, and it can really help because if you're left with a set, there's ways that you're suddenly like, right, we can take this apart easier. We know where this is going, and you're able to tell a really nice story.
So I noticed you've moved to new materials library,
Yeah.
which I'm intrigued
Yeah.
by.
No, I was waiting.
Yeah, what's that about?
Yeah. So, we move into the innovation field now. And I think there is quite a lot of very interesting innovations happening on the material science at the moment, incorporating the circular economy principles. But still they need to be pilot, they need to be tested, the materials need to be approved. And we are starting to work with this new materials library that is called Material Driven, that is based in London, but it's not the only one. There is a couple of other material libraries around, and they are linking innovators, startups, and new materials to potential users, because this obviously, to be able to replace different materials, there's a demand is needed. Mm-hmm. So initially, the construction industry probably are the ones that are going to start. They are already starting to test quite a lot of these different materials. There is quite a lot of innovation in insulation, for instance, but maybe some of those materials can be used in theater and cinema sets, and these are the ideas that we're starting to explore. It's still exploratory. There is quite a lot of use of natural materials as well. And one of them is the use of mycelium, mushrooms, really, to produce materials. And there is another great exhibition at the moment in Somerset House, and this is what I mean about really start looking at artists that are using these materials. Those are bricks. So at the moment there is experimentation on using bricks as construction materials and as insulation materials as well.
As someone who hates mushrooms, I'm like, this is brilliant. Use them for that. Stop putting them in my food.
As well as, yes, as furniture, and in the exhibit I didn't take a picture, but there were also some prototypes for shoes as well, so there could be in costumes as well, and different uses. The interesting element is that then this is the organic circle of the circular economy, is that then you could resend all these materials to the people that produce them, and they can close down the circle as well, growing in a way, growing your own materials. And that's a new type of business model, which is quite interesting. And in terms of mushrooms, it's quite interesting because mushrooms can decompose and reduce the toxicity as well of painting. So I think there is another challenge there to reduce the toxicity of paintings being used. If those sets are being burned and they are painted with toxic paintings, all those compounds go into the atmosphere, and then they deposit as well on the soil, depending what it is. So it's something we start looking as well, what can be the role of mushrooms reducing the impact of toxic paintings. So there it's very encouraging. There is a lot of really very good innovation, I think, and it's about collaboration, it's about testing, piloting, and for that probably it needs a little bit of a number probably of you taking these challenges together. Maybe some piloting and then others learning, or some critical mass in a way, I would say, is needed to start testing these new ideas. In terms of lighting, I'm not going to go into detail, but there is as well some new models of business. So it is possible to rent lights. So there is companies where you actually rent, and then they go back to them, they maintain them, and then you can use them again in future productions. You may not need to spend the capital.
That's how, most of us tend to
work as well anyway.
Spend that.
Yes. Yes, because normally each play will require special lighting.
Yeah.
But this business model is also being applied for theaters that wanna change for LED in all the theater, in theater lights, for instance. If there is not enough capital, some companies actually invest and they keep the savings, because it's very easy to, in 3 or 4 years, you normally pay off when changing for LEDs.
I think if there's I think that also brings us around to something that we were talking about when Paul and I were chatting about aesthetics, because yes, the LEDs certainly, in terms of power usage, etc., but the aesthetic is quite different to a tungsten light. And you were speaking a little bit about sort of changing the aesthetic, whether we can continue to try to do the same thing in a different way.
Yeah, well, that's the question, isn't it? Really,
Yeah.
whether we do the same thing in a better way, or whether we need to actually fundamentally change how we're designing and what we think, a good production looks like. What the level of spectacle is that that we expect and things like that. I mean, in a way, we don't. I think LEDs are an interesting example because the amount they've improved. Obviously, then lighting designers will insist that there is a big difference still, I think, but they have improved hugely over time. So, where we might be. Perhaps we won't have to make such distinctions, and there will be, but obviously we have to move fast, so we can't wait for those technological solutions. But yeah, it is a really interesting
Yes,
point.
we, as part of the Green Guidance review, we want to do a bit more research on lighting as well, because the lighting companies are very accelerating the research and development programs as well, and it's a very moving area at the moment. I do remember a research that I looked at a while ago where somebody tested the responses of the audience making the same production with LED and making the same production, what would you call it, a more traditional approach, and actually the audience didn't notice the difference. So I think there is also something that is related at the critical eye of the one that is really working in the industry, and then maybe a less prepared eye cannot really notice those differences. So, but I think it's about keeping this exploratory approach about what's coming and
When we're talking about
testing
new
it.
materials, I'm interested in how, like, for instance, First Mile is looking at what new materials are coming out, and then are you looking into then what we do with them after and how actually recyclable they are?
Yeah, so I think that, it's similar to, like I said, it's similar to construction waste in the same way, that you will always look at taking away in terms of what different sets are made of and then what we can do with them afterwards. So a lot of wood, for example, it can be reused and repurposed. Same with, rubber. Metal has obviously still got a value to it, and so it's got really good recyclable qualities that can be used over and over again. And like you said, with foam, for example, and various things like that. I mean, we work with so many different people now and constantly looking for new ways of recycling things. So polystyrene's always been something that for a long time, and foam actually, that people kind of went against, and it is a bit of a nightmare, but there are still places that can do something with it. Or rubber, for example. We collect rubber-based products. If you use rubber for any of your sets, or if there's any sort of props, etc., we get them made back into things like children's playgrounds and various things like that, so you can start to then have a nice end-of-life story for these things. So we are constantly looking into, we work with quite a lot of manufacturers, so if we come across a product that it's sort of, it could be something like as simple as like a coffee pod, but if it's made of multi-materials, could they make it from one material that then means it could go into a normal recycling stream? So we start to talk to manufacturers or different people about, the better ways that they could make things from the beginning so that it has a better end of life. So I think it kind of all comes into the process, but I think with sets, they're quite an individual thing, aren't they, in terms of what you need and what you need to build from a theatre. So it is about that design process of how you put all the bits together as much as anything, to be able to take it apart at the end and then be able to get those, because you always want to be able to get the best quality recycling possible if you can't reuse it. So you want to be able to do the best things with it. And I mean, you don't want things to go to incineration, but then if they do, we take things to be incinerated, for example, and then that powers houses within London. So at least then it's a nice story that comes around in terms of keeping it within at least London or in the UK. So I think there's, it's just that thought process at the beginning and having an understanding. And this is the sort of thing that we can provide, which is this material, it can be reused for this, or this is what will happen to it if it can't be reused. And people understanding that, okay, so if I use this material, this is what can happen to it. If I make a better choice with this, actually this has a better end of life, or this has more chance of being able to be reused or being made into something else. So it's kind of those informed choices and having a breakdown of those.
So I think we're going to open up to some questions in a moment. And I'm curious from people in the room, like one thing that we're trialing at the Unicorn that I was actually a little bit nervous about putting in place, but seems to be received okay, is we've had sort of our creation budgets, and then sort of in the world that the production manager sees, there's a line for disposal.
Yeah.
And trying to actually bring that into the initial design conversation, so that part of the budget is actually about how are we going to then get rid of this, and that factors into the initial design conversation. So I'm interested if anyone else is thinking that way, or has tried something like that, or how are you looking at the end life of the materials in the space? Yeah.
Nick Brown, I teach at Central School of Speech and Drama.
Hi.
And we are trying to get the student production managers and the student construction managers involved in how do I take this apart so that it can be recycled. Our estates department don't set a brilliant example, however.
Yes.
National Theatre Wales, part of the conversation we have with designers is what will be the future use of this. And we have changed decisions about what's going to be used on certain sets if there hasn't been an obvious future for it. And between 80 and 90% of what we buy for a show is reused, not recycled. And that is part of the kind of brief that we have.
And how does that then fit in, sorry, I don't mean to, I'm just curious about the comments, with storage, because that's what, we struggle with that, like, yeah, we want to reuse it, but where on earth do we put it?
There is an issue there. Yeah. But also, you have an on life for it. We made a show with a couple of tons of corrugated iron. We made everybody aware in the local community and the local environment that was going to be available. And so the get out was much easier because there's a lot of people turning up in vans and taking it away. Because we also do site-specific and site-located theatre, we are connected in a different way. It's much easier in many ways. But it's always part of it. What's the future like for us?
Yeah, I've seen that in other theatres in Wales as well, that they are thinking actually who else could be using this at the end of the process, and how can we actually change a little bit the design as well to make it useful for them. So I think these are the interesting things that link to maybe mission and purpose of culture, really, that goes beyond the specific space of a theater, no? A theater in a community using the materials that come from somewhere else in there, somewhere, it can be in another country as well or somewhere else. So I think these are interesting conversations, ongoing conversations that is quite important to start having, really. And there is different stages. Yes, ideally, there was this. The first time we start looking into this was with the Old Vic. With the Young Vic, not with the Old Vic. Sorry, we're working now with the Old Vic. With the Young Vic, and that was 6 or 7 years ago. And they set up from the very beginning of the play they were gonna do is that everything was gonna be sourced from somewhere else. It was not gonna be new, really, and it should be reused somehow. Mm-hmm. And then they employ somebody to make part-time to make sure that was happening. And the conclusion was that they save money as well, which is quite important, really, at this time in terms of saving production money. So you give employment, you reuse, so minimize waste. So there's quite a lot of different benefits, really.
So there's some comments coming in, I think, from the Facebook stream.
Yeah, just sort of jumping back to the conversation about lighting. We had a comment from an LD who was saying that there is quite a lot of top range stuff that's out there at the moment on the market that is acceptable sort of aesthetic-wise. But for someone who's usually working on low-budget productions, using LED fixtures is beyond their stretch. And even if you can, it's then challenging to actually be able to have the technicians who are skilled in that particular form of LEDs as well, various desks as well. We also had a comment from David Ripley from CSSD. He said, eco-design means that everyone should be considering it now, not when expected general ban on tungsten and bulbs starts in about 5 years, or when manufacturers are stopping making them. There's also, just following up, he was following up on Nick's point there as well. As we have students who need to practice, we frequently check stuff out that we could have used later in the year. Treads being prime example. We also have no storage, so we are between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea most of the time.
Which I would assume is probably the case for a lot of London theatres. Storage is always a huge and very pricey commodity, isn't it?
Yeah.
So there's an interesting point there.
Yeah. And we're going to a meeting at City Hall for a group. They had a committee about reusing things in the arts, and they had all gone over to see this amazing facility in New York, giant airplane hangar where everyone could bring everything and then pick everything up, that was sort of subsidized to about $1 million a year. And we were like, yes, we'd like that, thank you.
The Royal Opera stores its sets in Wales, so it's thought outside the box, and they have a very complex system whereby everything goes substage, it goes onto lorries overnight, and they're taken back out to Wales. It takes a lot of planning, but they have managed that whole storage issue by just removing it a couple hundred miles.
Yeah.
And we can store our equipment, to identify our equipment online. Where it is physically stored is another question, and we can manage that in a different way. The opportunity to be online storage is extraordinary.
And there is quite a lot of opportunities on the IT sector as well to be able to identify through quite cheap sensors where and create databases of where your sets are, the same for costumes. So I think it's being open to new ideas in terms of maybe have new business models really that can help.
Questions?
It's not so much a question. So I'm from the suppliers of the industry, a textile supplier in the main, so I'm sort of fascinated. I've got 100 questions probably every year. There's so many points because there's an issue around terminology that I'm sort of need settling in terms of recycling. Is that reusing or actually recycling? We're finding that people are saying this is recyclable, but actually what you really need is just repurpose, reuse or something else. We've got to strike a balance between safety, because obviously everything we supply is FR, so there's obviously a chemical process on one end if you use NDFR. fabrics, or then if you use synthetics, you've obviously got polyester, so you've got kind of issues there. So you sort of issue there. We've got the price factor, because obviously the more technological advanced the fabric is, generally more expensive, and obviously we've already heard budgets have come into the equation when it comes to lighting. That's the same with what we deal with. And I don't, there isn't really a question to it, but I'm sort of, we've seen how 4 or 5 different separate kind of industries come to me recently to say we really want to do something. So the ABTT are getting an exhibition carpet this year. Sure, completely scrapping it because it's probably hitting your waist, isn't it really? So we're using a cotton flooring for see how that goes. BBC and ITV are looking to recycle their display film. They'll use 3 or 4 tonnes a year just for the Dancing on Ice and these kind of Saturday TV shows. Then we've had a few customers saying they've now been challenged with having nothing on their sets that goes to landfill, which again is obviously been kind of discussed here as well. As a supplier, we're in a strange position because we're always striving to give a better breadth of material and choice to designers in particular. That's why I spend most of my life trying to tell people how much, what a range we've got. But the wider your range, the more, I guess, textured, or the fabrics that work better with lighting, you're then weaving in different threads, you're mixing fibres, you're putting lurex into it. It gets a little bit boring, but if you want something different, it involves generally combining materials, which then makes it harder to do. So there isn't really a point other than from a supplier point of view. Obviously, we're trying to react to the industry and provide choice. And for us to then develop a recyclable or using a recycled material takes investment, and then I guess commercially, which always has to come in, we're then thinking, right, okay, do a return. So again, it's not really a question, it's a point, and I'm just fascinated in sort of how your analysis is going, because we're seeing some people wanting to take some real action.
Yeah.
So.
Well, when Pip and I were talking earlier, I was sharing that I listened to a lot of podcasts and things, not just about sustainability in theatre, but in fashion and in lots of different industries. And I heard one person speaking who was saying, and I can't remember their name, I'm sorry, terrible at that, but they were saying you almost have to choose what sustainable or what ethical means to you, because the bottom line is something that is completely ethical in every possible permutation and completely sustainable is just not there. And part of me finds that a little bit depressing, but part of me also finds it a little bit liberating, because it means we can work hard, but it doesn't mean we have to tick every single box. Like, it's about weighing things up, and if a material ticks 8 out of 10 boxes, is that our standard, or what? Where is our standard? And I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on that or wants to chime in on that, but how do we balance the fact that there isn't really a thing out there that is the perfect material?
I think that sorry, the final thing that a few people have said against that in the ABTT and usually is just something, just do something, Again, it's not, I'm not going to mention where I'm from, but as a business we used how many tons of plastic here, which was this really thick plastic to wrap all of our stuff. It was impregnable, but it was unnecessary. So we switched to a fully recycled, non-recyclable plastic, cost neutral. It was something, people didn't notice it, didn't have any damage or any detriment to the product. We've got electric cars and everything, these little things that sort of seem a little bit meaningless, but I think if everyone's waiting for that big gesture, you never actually get anywhere. So I think it's just maybe managing expectations of.
I think it is better choices, and where you can make small changes, they all add up, and if we all make small changes, it's everyone thinking that they've got to go the whole all of the time. It's not, as you said, it's not possible. And I think that people are so ready to preach and give, all the things that you're doing wrong, and actually, plastics get such a hard rap, but what looks after your medicines and all the things that we need, we have to, being sensible and using them when we have to. So, advising people, if you can get things made from recycled materials, recycled plastic, then that's ideal, because you're driving, people to buy and produce recycled material. It's things like with clothing, for example, fast fashion and all of those things, they tend to come in those poly bags that for a long time haven't been able to be recycled. So we do something with those, that we collect them keep them separate, and then we send them to where we make our waste sacks, and then those poly bags get made into first mile recycling sacks. So you've got a nice story. So if Intertex are using, for example, first mile to collect their poly bags, they then get made back into the sacks that they use to put their waste out. So there's things that you can do like that just reduce your footprint. You know, leather, it can get made back into aeroplane seats. So, you know, it might be that you can't reuse that for a show or something, but you could break down that leather and get it made, and it could be a Ryanair seat or something, you don't know. But, you know, so there are things that you can do, and it's finding out some of this stuff. Can we do everything all of the time? No, but can we find out what we can do and make those choices where we can? I think that's the key thing.
Other comments or questions then?
Yeah, I mean, I've been really focused on eco-practices for a very long time, and I took on the title of eco-sonographer about 5 years ago to sort of bring that more into visibility. And I suppose for me, there are two main things. One is that I began to position my practice from the perspective of that the aesthetic outcome wasn't the only measure of success. And secondly, and I think very excitingly, I started to see the creative opportunity in an ecological approach to design. And I have to say that it's important to realise that an ecological approach to design doesn't automatically mean that you get a particular aesthetical outcome. So, for example, if you were to, I've made a show, for example, using completely industry surplus from the film industry, so I made costumes that were all the leftovers from a Tom Cruise film, so somebody was actually dancing around in remnants of Tom Cruise's suit or whatever. I've done something scenery salvage, where I did a completely closed-loop design, and I used the adventure of going there and looking for stuff as the impetus of the design, and then I returned it to there at the end. And I persuaded the company I work with the preciousness of what I've done, because I turned it into an artwork, and I said, I can't repeat this. So I encouraged them to store it, which they did, and they used it for their second run. And then the thing that I've got in the Staging Places show at the moment is made, I have to say that everything I've done has actually been concept driven, so I haven't felt like I've kind of like come from, oh, this has to be a worthy thing. I've come from what concept and what excited me. So with the one I've got there, that was to create a kind of terrain or environment that could hold something of the ecological collapse story. It was about an expedition. So I went and got all my materials from the Reading Festival, in fact through Julie's Bicycle and Festival of the Public. I went and gathered all the sleeping bags and tents to create my design from. And then that, because of going there and seeing the absolute, I was in shock, because it was like a sea of tents and sleeping bags. And I could not believe it. So that spurred me on to start to talk about it. So I started to talk about what I'd seen there, and that became part of extending my role as a designer. So then I started to, you know, in after-show talks or, you know, writing up stuff and whatever, began to share that experience. And I know now there's been a big focus on that and a big drive to change that. So I guess it's looking for these opportunities and seeing them as, yeah, it's a small steps we're all making, but actually not feeling like it's an invitation, is what I'm trying to say. It's actually a springboard for something quite exciting. And then you can have all these wonderful conversations with people you might not have had you stayed more in your kind of more your world, let's say. And then this with the SDP, we're having this quite SDP, Society of British Theatre Designers.
Everyone gets it.
Yeah. So then we started to have this, you know, we began these conversations and to really bring out our fears and concerns and to come together as a group to celebrate our diversity of designers and then to work. I've been made to, I don't know what's the Stage Pledge, but there is a sort of working group coming together to build on something.
Yeah, well, I think that is worth flagging up.
I think it is worth mentioning, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things that we talked about at this meeting around how to encourage good practice and create the sort of psychological side of it? Like, so is it scary to bring up, do you want to be the first one who brings it up in a production meeting? Can it be built into the agenda automatically? There's kind of interesting things around that. And one thing that came up is the EcoStage pledge, which you should talk about because you co-founded it, I think. Sorry, we're doing a little two-person act now, aren't we? It's not the plan.
I really don't want to take too much airspace, but basically, so 5 years ago, Tanya Beer, myself and Alice Holt, who are all eco-money designers, started to have a conversation about how do we bring sustainable practice more out and into conversation. And Tanya Beer actually went on to coin the phrase eco-sonography. And so we set up this online pledging system, and in a nutshell, it's a public commitment. It was designed to stimulate conversations and have an evolving online resource, so it would have links to Julie's Bicycle resources and all other sorts of resources. And it's a pledge, so you go through and you will sign up to a pledge and you get a rather beautiful logo that you can use to declare your interest, and it becomes an online community of people. So we did this 5 years ago, and we launched it at ArtCop 21, I think it was. And it did quite well, but it didn't do so well from the point of view that we didn't really have the right, let's say, back end to the website to make it free. So we now have this kind of beginning of something that we're looking at relaunching and reinvigorating and making it more right for now, because in those 5 years, as we're all fully aware, things have actually got more rapid and changed.
Yeah.
So one of the reasons I am here really is because we wanted to make links with production managers and other groups in the industry, so that maybe we could all be part of this and actually work out how it would be the most effective, look at it from the point of view of its structure and its reach. So can it reach students, can it reach existing, can we have theatres pledging to it and so forth. So really make it a really kind of useful platform that designers and other groups can connect with. So we're hoping that we've got some working group meetups, and we'd like to invite other people would like to come. And the idea is to, if it goes well, we would launch it at the next ArtCop.
Yeah, to coincide with the Glasgow.
Yeah, ArtCop, whatever it is, 20. I've got the number.
I think that's what you'll need to do.
This November, isn't it?
Have those conversations.
It's in November 26th.
Yeah.
So it's just put that out there,
Sorry, I missed the name of the initiative.
So it's called EcoStage Pledge, and it does it. I've been paying faithfully for 5 years to keep it up on the line, on the internet, So very much like to link with colleges and really kind of get it to be a usable thing. So when people see the logo, there is an association
they know what
with good practice. The important thing is to really underscore that this is like the best. It's not like you get told off if you do something, you know what I mean? This is an actual, proper active conversation about what we're all doing together, and it really is, it's really meant to sort of stimulate conversation and change and support.
Which is, I think, what we're all
Not
really
alienating
looking for.
Yeah. But also the rapidity of what is now required as well is important.
Yeah.
Hopefully that might excite
I think, yes, I think we'll move one more or two more questions, then we're going to have to wrap this panel up, so then we can move on. Yeah, let's go there first.
Sure. This is a question for you, Jen, actually. As much as, obviously, we're a room of like-minded people who are passionate about sustainability, however, I also work under an estates department, or we work under a producer, and I know my estates department really just cares about how much time and money I'm spending, and they want that to be as low as possible. So how do we... And even extending not only upwards from production management, but down as well with our heads of construction who want to slam a set in and out and go home and that sort of thing. So how do we get people on side without alienating anyone, and people want something that's easy and that's cheap, and that's not necessarily what this is at this stage. So how do we get people on side with green initiatives?
Do you mind if we bring that into the second panel when we have our... No, because it's a great point, and I think when we come back and we're talking about sort of the production managers on the stage, I think that would be great. Yeah.
I'm from Lambda, and just wanted to add that reusing and recycling is quite a challenge when you're training young people to make sets every 6 weeks. We make 4 shows every 6 weeks, and there's a time and there's a storage issue. But a thrilling thing is that sustainability is at the top of the agenda for the students and is being driven by them. So I think with all the training providers, the graduates that we're turning out every year are passionate about it, and they will become, in a year or 2 or 3 years' time, the production managers, the head of construction. So it's going to move quite, I mean, maybe not quick enough, but every new person entering the industry has it absolutely forefront of their minds.
Which is great.
Which is great.
Just one little last comment here. There's quite a few people watching, obviously. Just a message from a supplier saying, what can suppliers of equipment do to help the theatre industry and sustainability? I do various pieces of data help. Would it be helpful to have information of how many times that piece of equipment has already been out and used? Or would it be helpful to be thinking about how we can offer information to our clients regarding their carbon footprint of the parts of their event? So just, thinking about practical ways that we can relay that information back to the actual client, especially if you are being the middleman as a production company as well, especially when you're looking at events rather than theatre and that much quicker turnover as well.
Thank you so much, Sarah, Paul, Graciela. I think we'll take just a 15-minute break, have a comfort break, stretch your legs, and we'll come back for panel 2. Thank you.
Very good.